subscribe and press the bell icon.
CDO funded program, and we are working across a number of areas. It's a £37.5 million program, out of which about £15 million is for technical assistance to government of KP. And under the program, we are working across a broad range of interventions. But one area where we are working very closely with the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is to create more fiscal space, which has become all the more important because in Pakistan, provinces traditionally have been relying more on federal transfers. And in the last few years, there has been this realization that provinces need to generate more own source revenue, more domestic resources, and sales tax on services is one of the most important and major heads. And Khyber Pakhtunkhwa has done wonders. And if you look at last year, there has been a 64% increase in the collection in sales tax on revenues, on services, by COVID-19. So government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is already doing a wonderful job. And we also think that other provinces have also done a great job. There's a great deal of learning that the province can benefit from. So with that thought in mind, we commissioned this research paper that was co-authored by Anjum Naseem Saab and Faisal Rashid Saab, who jointly wrote this paper. And this paper is not an end in itself. This is supposed to lay the foundation for future reform work for government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And we are working very closely along with other FCDO funded programs with KPRA, with Finance Department, with the Finance Minister in pushing this reform agenda. And apart from SEED, there is a subnational governance program. It is also helping the government in this area. So I think UK has been instrumental in kind of pushing this area of reform. So with that, I'll leave you to the presentation by Faisal and back to Dr. Saab. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I had two versions of the program. One version is says that Mr. Chaudhry will speak at the end, and the other version says that Mr. Chaudhry will be speaking now. As if Mr. Chaudhry has joined us, we will give him the choice whether he wants to speak now or later, or both now and later.
Well, it's late, so I think we can start.
Okay. I have on my screen it says Mr. Chaudhry twice, so one of those occasions he will be there himself. If not, let's proceed with the presentation of the report. Please, Faisal Saab, please proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Saab and Hassan. Let me share my slides. Let me know when you can see these slides, please. Can you see this, Hassan?
We can see your slides.
All right. So, as already introduced by Dr. Ijaz Nabi and Hassan Khabar Saab, I think this is sales tax on services. This is no secret that this is the most important provincial tax now. The numbers speak for themselves. Percent of the provincial tax revenue in Pakistan. It's also a fact that in 2010-11, which here has been written as FY11 in short, the collection was being done by FPR on behalf of all the provinces, and at that time, provinces received a transfer of 66 billion rupees on account of state provinces. So this was equivalent to about 0.36% of GDP. Later on, as was decided by the National Finance Commission in 2001, provincial governments started to establish their own provincial revenue authorities and boards. And by 2015, all of the provinces had established their own revenue authorities in Pakistan. So by 17 and 18, this tax was contributing about 224 billion rupees, which was equivalent to 0.67% of GDP. So you can really see that in terms of tax to GDP ratio, this was doubling of revenue. So this was something quite significant, and the provinces had done a good job, and that is what it seemed. So this was the upside of provincialization of the tax collection. However, there was also a downside, and we can see that there was a kind of a fragmentation of the value-added taxation system in Pakistan as a result of provincial tax collection, and that manifested itself in multiple tax rates that were imposed by the provincial governments. There were even sort of differences in the principles of taxation. So one province argues for the origin principle and the other argues for the destination principle of taxation. Input adjustment because of involvement of 5 revenue collection authorities became difficult, and that has started to result in higher transaction costs for businesses in Pakistan. And that is kind of the source of inefficiencies as a result of this initiative of governments in Pakistan. So that's the kind of context in which this paper has been initiated. So I think this is a very important tax. It is very important for provinces, but it is also causing increase in the cost of doing. So here are the main objectives of the study. So the objective of this policy note was to review the current system of sales tax on services in KPRA and other provinces, or the provincial revenue authorities, with primary focus on Punjab Revenue Authority. And we are aiming to identify lessons for improvements in KPRA. So basically that was the objective of this policy note. And in terms of some of the further background, we also had a similar webinar a few months ago in which Dr. Michael Best presented some of the international sort of findings of those findings. And here they are on the, this is the crux of his presentation. So basically, sales tax and services are complex tax, and there is a very clear incentive for businesses to basically report their transactions, business-to-business transactions, to the tax collection authorities. And the reason is that without doing that, they cannot basically claim their tax credits. So they cannot claim input tax adjustments unless they actually report their B2B transactions to the tax authorities. However, in case of individuals, the situation is very different. They do not have, because they are the final consumers, they cannot claim any input adjustment. So basically, they have no incentive to demand that final tax is reported to tax authorities. And that is kind of the problem in services taxation in Pakistan and around the world. So basically, there is a need to create incentives for consumers to generate a trail of their transaction. And that is why many governments come up with systems which provide, offer lotteries, tax rebates, and other incentives to taxpayers to basically report their transactions to revenue authorities. Similarly, many governments have resorted to introduction of withholding taxation. So wherever you see the money, you should tax it. That is an important principle in the modern taxation of sales tax. Similarly, innovative solutions have been developed. So IT is being used very widely because this tax involves filing of a large number of tax returns every month. And there are so many transactions that are involved. So without the introduction of technologies cannot be collected effectively and efficiently. So KPRA, I think Hassan also mentioned that it has made very good progress, and that is visible on this slide. So the number of taxpayers who are registered with KPRA has gone up from 323 when the authority was created to about 8,000. Similarly, in 2014, the collection was only 6 billion, which had increased to 17 billion in the last financial year, which was 2019 and 20. A lot of improvements in HR capacity have taken place, and I think visibly KPRA has started to use improvements in tax collection, and that is I think exemplified by the introduction of an SMS portal, decision support system, which helps the management of the field staff. And they have also come up with their own version of a restaurant invoice monitoring system, which is going on, which has been implemented in some of the other provinces for a number of years. So I think with this background, I would like to start by saying that KPRA has done really well. However, I think there are some challenges still there on the policy and administrative side. which need to be resolved to make sure that the tax actually lives up to its potential.
Faisal,
And I think in this regard, the biggest problem in Pakistan is kind of the fragment.
One quick clarification. You mentioned somewhere in the report that there are about 90 services that are being taxed. Is it possible to identify which service is contributing how much? Hello?
Ji, Faisal, I think you're muted.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. So, sir, the accounting system does not show us collection by services, but the FBR and the revenue authorities, they actually record every transaction against the services, so possible for them to identify or show collection by services. So it is available with all the authorities in Pakistan.
Because that would be very useful. And we can discuss it later during discussion time.
Dr. I can just interject for a minute. So we did look at some of the data for KPRA, and if I remember correctly, it's telecom and banking probably are the largest contributors in sales and services. And interestingly, and that's the reason for another conversation with KPRA, that right now when you look at the distribution, we seem to think that the enforcement dividends could multiply the revenues, because much of the revenues are coming from contributors who are already there, like from large corporates, as you said at the beginning. But that's like a big answer.
You see, the thing is that I mean, what we all need in all provinces and at the federal level also is additional tax revenue. This may simply be shifting the tax revenue from the federal to the province. It may not be any additionality. It is additional to the province, yes, but in the overall tax system, it may simply be a shifting of collection rather than additional revenue mobilization. But we can visit these issues later.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. I think we'll definitely have more discussion about these things in the Q&A section. And I think in terms of policy, one important area is that although provinces are taxing much bigger number of services right now compared to when it was being taxed by the FPR, however, there are still a large number of services which are outside the tax net. And by adding them, a lot of potential can be realized. And similarly, there are many services which are being undertaxed. So they are not really paying the kind of revenues that they should be paying. On the administrative side, why is this ineffective or a suboptimal situation? The problem is that IT is not being very effectively used. Their provinces are starting to use IT, but a lot needs to be done. Similarly, I think the general problem of taxation in Pakistan, that there is inadequate documentation, and then there are organizational weaknesses in the authority. I think these are kind of the major challenges being faced by the KPRA as well. So in terms of the areas of improvement that have been mentioned in the policy note, I think one important area is tax-based broadening. Any services, as I said, still outside the scope of tax, and provincial authorities are already thinking and trying to move towards a negative. So a negative list would mean that rather than adding new services to the scope of the tax every year, every service would be declared as taxable, and only the services which are declared as exempt, they would be exempt. All other services would be within the scope of the tax. And that would avoid a lot of hassle of bringing new services into the tax net through the Finance Act every year. And more importantly, I think that will help remove anomalies and interpretational disputes, which cause a lot of litigation in our taxation system. Because the service providers argue that the service that is taxable under a particular law, I'm not really providing that service. My category of service is slightly different, and that's why I am not subject to that tax. So all those disputes and litigation can be avoided if we move to a negative list of services. And that is the way goods are being taxed in Pakistan in any case. Area, I think, which kind of was hinted by Dr. Ijaz Nabi, is the identifying the tax gap. So I think it's really important that we sort of see the contribution of all the services in the revenue collected by KPRA and the other provincial authorities. If there are services which are not being taxed properly, we can actually develop a plan, we can focus on them, improve their compliance, and increase revenue yield from these services. So I think this type of studies, one of them was done in Punjab, and that identified a 70% tax gap in Punjab. Some of that has been plugged in the last 2-3 years. And I am sure a lot of relevant work has been done in KP after a study in 2015 when they tried the potential from taxable services. But I think it would be really nice if they actually do a study which sort of undertakes the review of the potential from all services. And that will really tie in very nicely with the idea of introduction of the negative list, because then we'll find out where there is greater potential and we can focus our efforts to collect revenue from that service or the group of services. Organizational capacity of KPRA, I think this authority was created in the Directorate of Excise and Taxation, and it basically inherited the kind of organizational structure that was prevalent in the directorate, and that basically meant that there was a concentration of different functions within a single position. So one officer was in charge of assessment, as enforcement and compliance, and sometimes audit as well. So I think that really is not the way a tax authority should be run. I think government has realized that, and they have therefore moved this authority into the finance department under the finance minister's own sort of surveillance, and that will help them actually organize this authority better. And it is recommended in the policy note that a thorough functional review of the authority should be undertaken. And in the light of that, the authority should be organized on functional lines. And that would mean that they would be able to sort of develop their own professional tax services, which would be focusing different specializations. And that is how an authority should be run. And I think capacity building has also been indicated as an important area, because right now there are capacity issues. People working in the authority do not kind of training that they should have to work in the authority. So I think in that regard, the authority can review the option of creating their own training academy, or they can use the existing academic institutions for capacity building of their staff. In any case, effective and efficient use of information technology could be very useful for KPRA, because these days IT is being used for tax-based broadening. Another objective is to establish a real-time connectivity with businesses, performance management of staff, dispute resolution through use of IT in a more sort of in a faster manner, improved inter-agency coordination, and tax compliance. And some of these examples are here highlighted in the boxes. I think the most exciting idea to me is the use of data scraping. So what is data scraping? This is basically use of IT to search, to identify new taxpayers. These days, in the times of COVID, in which the authorities were required to undertake surveys to identify taxpayers, new taxpayers who were not within the scope of their tax collection on their tax registry. Now this job is easier. You can
Is it only me who cannot hear, or?
He's back on.
So can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay. So I was talking about data scraping. So I think data scraping could be really useful in helping the authority sort of
Do you want to do it without the video? No, you can't because you have to show us your slides.
Dr. Nabi, he's disconnected.
Oh.
Yeah, I think we'll have to maybe give him a couple of minutes. So internets could be, yes, he's back.
Terribly sorry about the internet. I hope, okay, sure.
Thank you.
Hassan, I'm sorry, I cannot see my slides right now. Can you tell me which slide are you seeing so that I can start from there?
So I do see, yes. So I now see the bringing an IT for improved compliance.
Okay.
Now I see that.
All right. Okay. Thank you. So I think I was talking about data scraping. I think that can be used to identify new taxpayers very easily because the information about taxpayers is now easily available on internet. In the times of COVID, I think that's really useful. In Punjab, for example, this was tried, and in a day or so, the authority was able to identify more than 2,000 new restaurants and add them to their tax base. Similar thing can be done here in KPRA as well. Integration of public sector databases is another very interesting initiative where information can be used to effectively tax the service providers. For example, there are a number of there is PESI, there is Excise Department. They have a lot of information about the service providers. Through that, new taxpayers can be identified, and then the use of third-party data can also be done to check whether they are complying with the tax properly or not. A restaurant invoice monitoring system, I think this is quite famous. So through this, a real-time monitoring of collection and invoicing by restaurants can be done. And then in Punjab, a lottery scheme was also introduced to create incentive for people to report their invoices or send their invoices to the authority. And that led to a reported increase of 28% in revenue. A similar initiative is being taken in PRA for courier and hotel services. E-courts have been established as well. Similarly, there is a system of e-strive. E-strive basically helps the authorities, settle their input adjustments against each other and make the system more efficient and coordinated. Similarly, PRA has systems for effective monitoring the performance of their staff, and they call it PRA Mirror and PRA I. I think a little more on the e-courts because e-courts are helping the authority provide, helping resolve the disputes of the taxpayers vis-a-vis the authority, and the matters of appellate tribunal and commissioner appeals. They are using this forum for online filing of appeals, notices, cases list is made available online, hearing is done, and the decisions are also made available online. So this is a bit on the IT. IT can also be used for mass compliance, and an example has been that in Punjab, an audit compliance unit has been set up, and they have developed a risk criteria to review tax returns, and that criteria is sort of applied on all tax returns filed by the taxpayers. And if there are any anomalies, the tax returns can be then thoroughly verified, and further information can be sought from taxpayers, and that really has helped in identifying short payment of taxes and at times tax evasion by the taxpayers. So that's a very good use of IT as well. Apart from that, I think the taxpayer communication is really important. That's an area highlighted in the policy note because according to many experts, the lack of information or lack of awareness is one of the major reasons of non-compliance by the small taxpayers. So taxpayer awareness campaigns have helped in Punjab and other authorities to help increase the tax compliance. So I think a similar effort could be done in KPRA. They are working on it, but it can be made more effective by effective messaging for taxpayers. But I think, as many would agree, harmonization of sales taxation in Pakistan and having a semblance of integration into our system is really, really important because it is very difficult for businesses to operate in this situation. And for that, we have to sort of undertake to bring in political consensus. At least the provincial governments can have their own platform through which they can provide an opportunity to businesses to file a joint return that can help all the authorities. They can collect their own revenues, but the return would be only one. And that would also help settle their sort of input adjustment disputes as well. So National Single Window Initiative has been launched by the federal government, and that is under implementation at the initial stages. That should be pursued. Otherwise, if there are problems, the provincial authorities should definitely try to work out on their own integrated system in Pakistan. Finally, I think this is the final slide. I think this note basically provides you some of the important lessons that can be used by KPRA. A logical step would be to develop a tax reform strategy through exploring further on some of these areas and setting up of a donor coordination forum because as Hassan pointed out, there are a number of donors apart from FCDO like GIZ and some of the others, World Bank and USAID, who are also interested in supporting KPRA. So an action plan should be developed and responsibilities should be divided amongst the donors, and that would, I think, provide a lot of dividends to KPRA for future reforms. I think I'll stop here. I've taken more than allotted time, but that was the required thing, I think. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Faisal. This was excellent. I looked at your report, and you have summarized it exceptionally well. We have you've pointed out the potential, and you pointed out the solutions to achieving the potential. I think that's more from policy note of this kind. Fortunately, we've got good examples from within the country on this that you have out. So implementing the next step, we know it, and rolling out the reform should be relatively easy. Now we have. I request Mr. Hassan Daud Saab to his comment on the report. Thank you very much for joining. I know you are not feeling well. Wish you recovery, and very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, sir. I will be a bit low on my voice because my throat is still choked up. So with this said, I've just said to what Faisal has said, and in the last 2 days I was able to get sufficient time to read the policy document. I think the document is well crafted. The important aspect of capacity building, incorporating IT technologies, new ideas is some of the features of this report. I would just like to briefly explain what is happening in and around KP as a neutral person, because I joined from federal government, and what I observed was that the leadership, both political and administrative leadership within KP, are extremely pragmatic, extremely pragmatic in a sense that they understand that this is a watershed moment for them. They've done enough hard work in the last 7 years in transforming their province, integrating it into a madad, bringing novelty within the overall framework. You know, while working as within bureaucracy, novelty is not so encouraged. But now things are changing. New technologies are being embraced. New ideas are being embraced. I've seen that we have done mapping in shortest possible time. We are working into deregulation in shortest possible time. And Taimur Jagla Saab has been the champion of ease of doing business and bringing in tax reforms. The overall surge in collection of 64% and then new taxpayers about 51% is a great indicator of the effort that is being done. And this is not him only. I think he has a strong team. CM Saab is also supporting him in bureaucracy, finance secretary, ACS, chief secretary, and secretary industries and nodes like us are actually being part of their team. What is so encouraging to see is KPRA is now working on building their capacity, and Taimur Saab is actually managing the change management very well. Because I understand that bringing change is not so easy, especially in the overall framework of governance that we have. So the work done by C, UKAID, Faisal Saab, yourself, I think this will be a good stepping stone in order to take the right kind of steps. The overall environment in change in KP is changing. You know, we understand CPEC is coming, KPk is coming, and this watershed moment cannot be lost. And I think this pragmatism of the political leadership is helping us at an operational level to take bold steps, bring novelty in our ideas, and then create the kind of ease of doing business which is much required. I've seen KPRA being now forthcoming in helping people to adjust, bringing change management. And change management is not just KPRA. The customers also are, embracing this change. They are accepting the kind of help that is being forthcoming. We're setting up portals now. Within KP Business Portal, we have 17 line departments actually online. We have actually transformed the local government's initiative, and now as we speak, more and more changes are coming in terms of embracing technology. But there's always a caution, optimism in what we are doing. There is risk of being over optimistic. So I think the pace will continue. We will embrace this change. And I think the work that is being done by you will help us, navigate better through this process. Thank you very much. And I won't speak more because the champion of all this is here now. So let's hear him to what he says.
Hassan Saab, thank you also for participating today despite not feeling well. We really appreciate that. Jhagra Saab, welcome. It's great to have you with us as always. Faisal has already presented the report. Maybe I can ask Faisal to give us a 5-minute.
Sure. I think, by the way, I read the report. So I think it would be useful if you want to summarize both the report but also the discussion, if you like, in 5 minutes. And then I can happy to close if that is something that helps. I think I'm quite keen to also know how the discussion went and what is emerging as insight over it.
Right. So the discussion hasn't. Faisal made his presentation, and then Mr. Hassan Daud gave his remarks, and you had arrived by then. basically, Mr. Hassan welcomed the report and said that it would be very useful. He highly valued your leadership in transforming the revenue system of KP, which is fantastic. We had a bit of an exchange on the report very early on, in which I had observed that whereas this is fantastic for the province, that revenues have gone up by taxation of services, but when we look at the structure of services that are being taxed, it turns out that the bulk of the revenue is coming from IT and perhaps financial services related. Now, this I said in the overall scheme of the fiscal effort that we need to make as a country, this is simply shifting revenue collection from the federal to the provincial government. I think there's still an advantage in that, because the provincial government in capacity to collect revenue, which is fantastic, because that's been a weak side of our federal structure. But in additional news, and then Faisal pointed out that his report actually talks about the need for doing the tax gap analysis, because that will point out what additional services can be brought into the net so that we can actually have net additional revenue mobilization as opposed to a shifting of tax collection. So that we had a little bit of discussion on that. Since you are here, I would like to push forward my own hobby horse in this. I've seen on several occasions in the past when we've become very close to reforming, for example, in Punjab, the property tax system, and then suddenly manna from heaven arrived in the shape of the constitutional amendment, so that provinces started to get much more revenue, and the whole property tax reform was just thrown out of the window. So what I would like to suggest is that we really use this opportunity. Just because we are getting additional revenues from taxing services, not identifying new taxpayers, but just collecting the tax on services which would have been collected anyway. I think we should not lose sight of the fact that there is still a lot of work to be done on property tax reform, because I think for the provinces that has to be the golden goose. For the last 30, 40 years, no sector has added so much value as the property sector. And no sector has required public services like the property sector, because new sectors open up, they want all kinds of services, all kinds of infrastructure. And yet we are capturing a tiny fraction of what we should be capturing in the property tax. So it's fantastic that tax on services is available to the provinces, but we should not lose sight of the fact that we need to identify new services, that additional services that should be taxed, and B, that we should really continue to focus on the revenue base that already exists, and property tax is one such base. So that's my hobby horse. I have pushed it in your direction. It'd be great to get your comments, by way of conclusion or by way of suggesting new thoughts that can be discussed.
Look, I think that this is indeed a extremely important topic. It's a topic that I'm very passionate about. And it's paradoxically, it's strange to say that someone should be passionate about taxes as a topic, because by the way, yesterday I was filling in my tax returns, and it's painful, tedious, and also a sad process to see some money go from your pocket. But it's something that we must all contribute to, right? So whereas no one likes to give tax, I think countries are run on the revenue that they build. And Dr. Saab, as you said, I'll just start off by picking on a statement that, highlighting rather than picking on a statement that you talked about, which is about solving the fiscal challenge that we have, right? And I think this is indeed the right time to start triggering the right discussion on it, because it feels too often, and I talk here as a provincial rather than a party representative, it feels too often that in terms of solving the fiscal challenge, we are constantly trying to basically shift revenues from one federating unit to the other, right? We've closeted the solution space to a point where the federal government, which indeed has grave structural revenue challenges and has had so for a while, institutionally seems to think that the answer is a flip of the NFC award, which I personally don't agree with at all. And between provinces, when we actually talk of the NFC discussions, based on what I heard in the last attempted NFC, typically you have 4 provinces and the federal government saying that we're very poor, we need more money, right? And surely the answer has to be, as a country, if everyone doesn't have enough money, and it's true, I think and many of the people here will know better than anyone else, that while the provinces run roughly balanced budgets, right, in a way the provinces are forced to, and if you look at the 2 biggest areas where the provinces should be spending, i.e. health and education, and you look at the country's GDP spend on health and education, you will very quickly see that we spend about half of what we should be spending on health and education. Our spend on health is about 200 billion. Our spend on education is about similar. So effectively, that means there's 400 to 500 billion that I'm not spending in terms of quality teachers, doctors, facilities, operationalizing, and there are true problems there, right? I've recently analyzed the budgets of many of our secondary hospitals, and whereas the salary budget, which is actually in the context of a hospital quite important because it means technical manpower, can be between 500 and 700 million, the non-salary budget is less than a tenth of that, about 50 million, 80% of which tends to be medicine. So basically you're left with 10 to 15 million to run a hospital for a year, with which you can effectively, I guess, install a few new fans and clean up the place twice a year. If you think of road maintenance, if you think of the irrigation sector, if you think of many other sectors where we should be spending more in terms of service delivery, we actually end up making the compromises that we don't need to make. If you think of a sustainable way of funding the pension challenge that we have, right, because we're eating that out of the budget, we'll actually make a case that provincial budgets should ideally be twice of what they are right now. But I obviously can't get that from a federal budget which already faces a primary deficit of sorts. So what is the answer? The answer is indeed that we need to work on revenue generation in a progressive manner, in the right manner, and perhaps we need to get out of our traditional molds and try and work together. I think there is another part of the answer, which is about significantly cutting the cost of public spending in government and other entities. And again, I know that the party in the past or individuals have had a different stance on this, but I'm personally very glad about the privatization of Pakistan steel mills, of the action to be taken in TIA. Because remember, we're never talking about the jobs of 5 or 10 individuals. We're talking about public money and where that is best served. So I think it is really important that we start to work all stakeholders, and I think there's a ton of work that we can do over here in terms of how the revenue base of the country can be increased progressively, fairly, sustainably, but certainly increased, because a 10% tax to GDP ain't gonna cut it if we want growth in Pakistan north of 5 or 6%. And then we've also got to work on the cost of government. In terms of the discussion on KPRA, sales tax on services, and I'll touch UIPT, and we've had this conversation before. I welcome the report. I endorse the suggestions that it's made, and I'll tell you we've worked on some of them, would welcome help on areas like tax gap analysis, but there's other areas where we're already working. So, for example, corporatizing the structure to make it more of a standalone organization. Over the last week, I looked at both the KPRA proposal for that and also studied the Sindh and Punjab, Sindh Revenue Board and Punjab Revenue Authority Acts to see what we can best do, and I hope to do that in this year. I can tell you that though this isn't the beginning of our reform journey, and my personal experience working in the private and development sectors, reforming KPRA and getting results out of it was one of the first things that I personally invested time in after assuming office in this government. And happy to say that over the last 2 years, revenue at KPRA essentially at least have doubled. Last year we got